November 21st, 1997. A rehearsal space in Sydney. INXS is preparing for their 20th anniversary tour, running through songs they've played thousands of times over 2 decades. Kirk Pengilly stands on stage with his saxophone, watching his best friend Michael Hutchence work through vocals. They've been doing this together for 20 years, since that first meeting in 1977, when Michael recruited Kirk to join the band. 20 years of friendship, 20 years of making music, 20 years of shared stages and shared lives. The rehearsal wraps up late in the afternoon. Kirk packs his saxophone, Michael grabs his jacket. They exchange a few words about the tour schedule, nothing deep or meaningful, just the casual conversation of people who will see each other again soon. "See you tomorrow," Kirk says as they head towards separate cars. "Yeah, see you tomorrow," Michael replies. Those words hang in the air between them, ordinary and unremarkable. Kirk drives home, having no idea he'll never see his best friend alive again. 24 hours later, Michael is gone, and Kirk Pengilly spends the rest of his life wishing he'd said something different, something more, during those final moments together. Kirk and Michael's friendship started in 1977, when they were both young musicians trying to make it in Sydney's competitive music scene. Kirk was playing saxophone in another band when Michael saw him perform and approached him afterwards. Michael had this vision for INXS, saw the potential for saxophone to give them a distinctive sound that would set them apart. But beyond the musical reasons, Michael and Kirk just clicked as people. Their personalities complemented each other, Michael's intensity balanced by Kirk's steadier presence. The friendship that formed that night became the foundation of their 20-year partnership. Through INXS's rise from Sydney pub band to international superstars, Kirk and Michael's friendship deepened and evolved. They experienced everything together: the early struggles when success seemed impossible, the gradual climb as they built a following, the explosive breakthrough when Kick made them global stars. In hotel rooms and tour buses, in recording studios and backstage areas, Kirk and Michael talked about everything. Not just music and career, but life and relationships and fears and dreams. That's what happens when you spend 20 years with someone. You become part of each other's story. By November of 1997, Kirk had watched his best friend struggle through the most difficult period of his life. Michael's relationship with Paula Yates consumed him with drama and chaos. The custody battle over Paula's daughter drained Michael emotionally and financially. The effects of the Copenhagen brain injury from 5 years earlier continued affecting Michael's moods and behavior in ways Kirk noticed but didn't fully understand. Kirk saw his friend deteriorating but didn't know how to help, didn't know what to say that might break through Michael's insistence that everything was under control. The November 21st rehearsal was meant to prepare INXS for a tour celebrating 20 years as a band. 2 decades of making music together, surviving the highs and lows of the music industry, remaining relevant when so many of their contemporaries had faded. Kirk looked forward to it, to being on stage with Michael and the rest of the band, doing what they'd always done best. But the rehearsal itself felt off in ways Kirk noticed without fully processing. Michael seemed distracted, his energy lower than usual. He hit the notes and sang the lyrics, his professionalism carrying him through even when his heart wasn't fully in it. But Kirk, who'd watched Michael perform for 20 years, could tell the difference between real engagement and going through the motions. Michael was going through the motions, doing what needed to be done without the spark that usually animated his performances. During the rehearsal, Michael's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call, and Kirk watched his friend's body language change. Michael's shoulders tensed, his free hand clenched into a fist. His voice took on an edge that Kirk recognized as stress and frustration. The call was about the custody situation, another complication in the legal battle that had been consuming Michael's life for months. When Michael returned to rehearsal after the call, something had shifted. The distraction that had been present before intensified. Michael barely present even as he stood on stage singing. Kirk wanted to ask if everything was okay, if there was anything he could do to help, but the dynamics of their friendship and the setting of band rehearsal made that conversation difficult. You don't interrupt rehearsal to have deep emotional discussions. You finish the work, then maybe find time afterward to check in privately. Kirk made a mental note to talk to Michael properly soon, to find a moment when they could sit down without the rest of the band around and have a real conversation about what was going on. That moment never came. The other INXS members noticed Michael's distraction too. Andrew Ferris, who'd been writing songs with Michael for 20 years, could tell when his creative partner's mind was elsewhere. Tim Ferris, John Ferris, and Gary Beers all picked up on the vibe that something was off. But like Kirk, they didn't know what to say or do in that moment. They assumed Michael was having a bad day, that whatever was bothering him would resolve itself, that they'd address it properly when there was time. The rehearsal ended in the late afternoon. Everyone packed up their instruments and started heading out. Kirk found himself near Michael as they walked toward the exit. They talked about logistics for the upcoming tour, confirmed some detail about travel arrangements or accommodations. The conversation was completely mundane, the kind of practical discussion they'd had hundreds of times before. Nothing about it signaled finality or importance. It was just two people who worked together, making sure they were on the same page about scheduling. As they reached the point where they'd head to different cars, Kirk said the words that would haunt him forever. "See you tomorrow." Just a casual goodbye, an assumption that of course they'd see each other the next day, because that's what they'd been doing for 20 years. Tomorrow always came, and Michael and Kirk always reconvened for whatever came next. "Yeah, see you tomorrow," his tone matching Kirk's casualness. Then they walked to their separate cars and drove away in different directions. Kirk went home to his family, to his normal evening routine. He probably had dinner, maybe watched television, went through the ordinary activities that fill our days. Michael was somewhere in his thoughts, but not as a source of urgent concern. Kirk knew his friend was struggling, knew things were difficult, but he'd talk to Michael soon, find out what was really going on, offer whatever support he could. There was time for that. Tomorrow, or the next day, or next week. Time stretched ahead with all its possibilities for conversations and interventions and healing. Michael spent that evening in ways that have been documented through various accounts and investigations. He had dinner with his father, Kel Hutchence, a conversation that Kel later described as relatively normal despite some underlying tension. Michael made phone calls, saw people, moved through the hours of November 21st, doing things that seemed like living until suddenly they became his final acts. At some point during that night, everything went wrong in ways nobody fully understood then or now. November 22nd, morning. Kirk probably woke up thinking about the tour schedule, mentally preparing for another day of rehearsals or meetings or whatever was on the calendar. Maybe he thought briefly about checking in with Michael, seeing if his friend was in a better headspace than he'd been the day before. Then the phone rang. Someone from INXS's management, or maybe one of the band members, voice shaking, saying words that didn't make sense. Michael was dead, found in his hotel room, gone. Kirk's world shattered in that moment. The news hit him like physical violence, knocking the ground out from under him. His best friend of 20 years, the person he'd said, "See you tomorrow" to just hours earlier, was dead. There would be no tomorrow. There would be no more rehearsals or tours or conversations. 20 years of friendship ended with a phone call delivering impossible news. The details of how Michael died, the circumstances in his hotel room, the questions about what exactly happened, all of that became public knowledge quickly. But for Kirk, those details mattered less than the simple, devastating fact that Michael was gone. His friend, his bandmate, the person who'd been part of his daily life for 2 decades, would never walk into a room again, would never pick up a microphone, never smile at Kirk during a saxophone solo, never call to talk about music or life or nothing in particular. Kirk has talked in interviews about the guilt had hit him almost immediately. The replaying of that final conversation, those meaningless words, "see you tomorrow," that became the last thing he ever said to Michael. Kirk tortured himself with all the things he could have said instead, should have said instead. What if he'd asked Michael directly how he was really doing? What if he'd pushed past the casual deflection and demanded real honesty? What if he'd said, "I love you," or "I'm worried about you," or "Please talk to me about what's going on"? The rational part of Kirk's mind knew that saying any of those things probably wouldn't have changed what happened. Michael's death resulted from a complex combination of factors: depression and brain injury and relationship chaos and substances, and a moment of desperation that nobody could have predicted or prevented. Kirk saying different words during their final conversation wouldn't have magically fixed everything. But grief isn't rational, and guilt doesn't respond to logic. Kirk carried the weight of those final words, regardless of whether he should have. Kirk also struggled with the memory of the November 21st rehearsal, replaying it endlessly, looking for signs he missed. Michael had been distracted, stressed by the phone call, not fully present. Were those warning signs that Kirk should have recognized as emergency? Should he have refused to let Michael leave that day until they'd talked properly? Should he have followed Michael to his hotel, insisted on staying with him, done something different that might have changed the outcome? The other INXS members dealt with their own versions of this guilt and replaying. Andrew Ferris questioned whether he'd been too focused on the band and the tour to notice how badly Michael was struggling. Tim, John, and Gary wondered whether they'd been too passive, too willing to accept Michael's assurances that he was fine. They all carried pieces of the same burden, the terrible knowledge that they'd been there and seen the signs and still hadn't been able to save their friend.
Kirk's grief was complicated by losing not just a friend, but a creative partner and the person who'd shaped his entire adult life. From age 25, when he joined INXS, until age 45, when Michael died, Kirk's identity had been intertwined with Michael's. They'd created music together, shared stages around the world, experienced fame and success as a unit. Losing Michael meant losing a piece of himself, having to figure out who Kirk Pengilly was without Michael Hutchence in the world. The funeral and public mourning period put Kirk in the position of grieving privately while also being a public figure dealing with media attention. Everyone wanted to know what happened, wanted quotes from band members, wanted Kirk to explain the unexplainable. He had to find words for something that felt beyond language, had to maintain some composure while his world had collapsed. The gap between private devastation and public expectation made grief even harder to process. In the months and years after Michael's death, Kirk had to decide whether INXS would continue without their frontman. The question felt impossible. How do you be in INXS without Michael? He was the voice, the face, the essence of what the band had been. But Kirk and the others also felt like the music deserved to continue, that the 20 years they'd built together had value beyond Michael's presence. They eventually chose to keep performing with different singers, though Kirk has been honest that it was never the same and could never be the same. Kirk became one of the most vocal band members in keeping Michael's memory alive and speaking honestly about what happened. He's given countless interviews over the years, talking about their friendship, about Michael's talent and kindness, about the tragedy of losing him. Kirk wants people to remember Michael as the complete person he was, the talented artist and loyal friend and complicated human being, not just as a tabloid headline or a tragic ending. In those interviews, Kirk often mentions that final conversation, those last words, "see you tomorrow." He's talked about how that phrase haunts him, how it represents all the tomorrows that never came, all the conversations they never got to have. Kirk uses that memory as a reminder to himself and others not to leave important things unsaid, not to assume there's always time later for the words that matter. Kirk has also been honest about his own struggles with depression and grief in the years since Michael's death. Losing your best friend of 20 years creates trauma that doesn't just heal with time. Kirk went through periods where getting out of bed felt impossible, where playing music reminded him too painfully of what he'd lost. He's talked about needing professional help to work through the grief, about the importance of not trying to handle that kind of loss alone. 27 years after November 22, 1997, Kirk Pengilly still carries the memory of that final conversation. "See you tomorrow" remains the last thing he said to his best friend. Kirk has learned to live with that reality, to accept that he can't change what happened, or what he said, or what he didn't say. But acceptance doesn't mean the pain goes away completely. It just means you learn how to carry it. Kirk continues to play music, to perform INXS songs, to keep the legacy alive. When he plays "Never Tear Us Apart" and hits that iconic saxophone solo that he and Michael created together, he's playing for both of them. When he talks to audiences about INXS's history, he makes sure Michael's name and contributions stay alive. Kirk knows that Michael's story ended in tragedy, but he works to ensure that's not the only thing people remember.
For fans learning about this final conversation now, it adds heartbreaking context to an already tragic story. Knowing that Kirk said, "See you tomorrow," and Michael responded casually, both of them assuming tomorrow was guaranteed, makes the loss feel even more sudden and senseless. They had no grand goodbye, no final meaningful exchange, just an ordinary conversation that became extraordinary only because Michael ran out of tomorrows. The story also reminds us how suddenly life can change, how the people we love can be gone without warning. Kirk went from "see you tomorrow" to never seeing Michael again in less than 24 hours. That kind of sudden loss leaves no time to prepare, no chance to say the things you always meant to say. Kirk's experience teaches the importance of telling people you love them while they're still here to hear it, of not putting off the conversations that matter. Kirk Pengilly lives with the memory of November 21, 1997. The rehearsal, the distracted friend, the phone call that changed Michael's energy, the casual goodbye, the assumption of tomorrow. He lives with "see you tomorrow" as the last thing he said to the person who'd been part of his life for 20 years. And he lives with the knowledge that tomorrow never came, that those ordinary words became extraordinary in their finality, that goodbye can happen without you realizing it's goodbye. 20 years of friendship, 24 hours from "see you tomorrow" to never again. That's Kirk Pengilly's story, carried for 27 years and counting. A reminder that the people we love deserve our time and attention today, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed.